Hi, sorry about that little break. We had a bit of difficulty with the video technology. I love technology. I'm having a good time with it lately. So performance and competence are the same. According to Halliday, they're two different ends of the same spectrum viewed at different time instantiations. Short view, it's like the weather, various instances of language activity, versus a long view, climate. So parole and lang, if you guys are familiar with Saussure at all, this is sort of a common way of dividing up language. It has to do with structural linguistics, which is part of what Chomsky was talking about. He was talking about the difference between performance and competence. And Halliday's viewpoint, as you know from the previous PowerPoint, it's text or system. So performance and text, short various instances, competence and system are the long view instances. For Halliday, he really makes a point that these are the exact same things. They're just looked at in different bits of time. One is the short view, one is the moment, one is the long view, the aggregate of those moments put together to represent a system. It's sort of like one of those little pictures, if you've ever seen those portraits of the, I can't remember the gentleman's name, the artist's name, but portraits of people that are made up of little bitty pictures of things that have to do with them, or little bitty pictures of themselves that are arranged in such a way to actually give you a big view. It's sort of a like a Sorrow painting, the people, the umbrellas by the lakeside, the pointillism aspect. These things, when looked at from a bigger point of view, give you a bigger picture of things. But that's, and I'll get into this a little bit, that's not quite what the competence performance distinction was going for. Code is best viewed from an intermediate perspective. So when we're looking at those two instances, the variety of small instances and the large component, what you get in the middle, Halliday argues, that intermediate perspective of language, being able to both see instances and the system at large. That intermediate perspective, Halliday says, is where codes actually occur. We have to view code simultaneously from both perspectives, seeing it as both a variation in the system, in the semantic climate, or semiotic climate, sorry, or meaning potential, and as different patterns in the text, in the semiotic, whether the way potential is instantiated. So here's the issue. We have two different perspectives. Code is in the middle of it, being able to see the actual potential, which is what the system supposedly represents or gives us, the different meanings that are potential, and the actual ways language is used. Colluding these two components, parole, lang, competence, performance, system, or system text, lang should be lang parole. That creates some problems in terms of his argument. And part of the reason is this. Number one, Bernstein himself will admit later on that, and Halliday does remark upon this or mention it in the context of the article, but doesn't really come back and refute it, given the fact that the whole notion of performance being the basis of where this argument starts. Bernstein admits later on that codes do not take place within the realm of Chomskyan performance. So the whole notion of potential and actualization being different or being the same creates a sort of notion that whatever stumbling little moments there are, that's the potential within the system, and if there's a pattern of that sort of stumbling, then you're going to have that within the language. Bernstein talks about the fact that what he's looking at in terms of code as a means of linguistic expression that is a pattern is not within the realm of performance or within the realm of actual speaking. It's within the realm of competence, and that's part of the huge issue in terms of education that Bernstein is getting at, that students with restricted codes have difficulty being able to latch onto the elaborated codes of the academic setting because they have competence issues, not performance issues. Chomsky's performance external behavior can be full of, that should be an of, talk about error, full of error that in no real way reflects the competence, cognitive capability. So all the stumblings, all the hesitations, all of the picking the wrong word instead of saying what you're really trying, or difficulty trying, that tip of the tongue phenomenon, trying to find a word. You have this information, you have the lexical information, you have the syntactic information. There are just issues in terms of actuating the performance of those things. Chomsky really wanted to separate those two issues. And Halliday in this article is mushing them back together. Part of the issue with that, I think, has to do with the fact that Halliday is looking at language as a social construct. He's looking at it from outside. In many ways, he's looking at it from outside the mind. Whereas Chomsky's entire focus of language is about the mind. And while Halliday's equation here could have something to do with looking at competence, performance, the individual linguistic system within the individual speaker or hearer, what he ends up talking about a great deal in the article has to do with social phenomena. So it doesn't necessarily seem that he may be talking about embodied social phenomenon, if you will, as part of cognitive process, but he's more concerned with language as an external vehicle of the culture as a whole, not so much in the individual. Whereas Chomsky's coming at it from different perspective entirely. Halliday's equation that performance text equals competence system does not follow the intent of placing codes within performance. Error in performance indicates error in linguistic ability. Again, if you're colluding these two things, then what you're basically saying is that whatever sort of missteps that are taken in linguistic ability, if there's a pattern of them, they will show up as being part of the system. Whether or not there's actually error there at all, depending on what you judge as being error, in terms of what you consider to be the competent linguistic system. Also, being able to look at certain particular instances or particular patterns of speech, as he wanted to say that code was reflective of, as somehow also being part of the system or competence of the system as a whole. That sort of just undercuts the entire point and purpose of discussing the whole performance competence distinction in the first place. That whole quote I showed about this is where there's no way this could be about deficit theory. Well, if they're the same thing, then yeah, there's a very real way this could be part of deficit theory. More problems and a contradiction within, close to where this argument takes place within the article. They, performance, competence are the same thing seen from different ends, as we talked about in that diagram. There is only one phenomenon here, the social activity of making meaning, though through language. But this phenomenon can be viewed from opposite perspectives, either as potential or as sets of instances. So again, he really doesn't want to talk about competence in terms of knowledge base, just in terms of potentials and meanings within the language system as a whole, which is of course different than what a cognitive look at language is going to do. And then later on he says, so consigning codes to the realm of performance was a way of saying that they had nothing to do with the underlying potential of the system. So the point and purpose of the argument was to say that the potential of the system is not affected by codes, thus it can't be part of deficit theory, because codes do not affect competence. But in his analysis, competence and performance are considered the same. So the whole opening, like I said, to this entire argument just sort of, it's like a dog chasing its tail a little bit. Which isn't to say that there isn't any kind of validity to what Halliday is trying to look at, but he is looking at it from a larger, like I said, sociological viewpoint that it just doesn't simply, it's not that the view of, or the pattern of trying to look at language from this particular way is necessarily a problem. It's that it doesn't disprove the notion that Bernstein's codes could have something to do with deficit theory. Okay, there's a little bit of a shade of meaning there that's different. Social construction of reality is a slippery slope. This is another aspect of what we're talking about when we're talking about elaborated codes and restricted codes as creating deficit theory possibilities. because when we're looking at language as being something that's agreed upon by social normatization, and that it is a construction of reality. Your view of the world is viewed through your culture, your language, the way you are socialized into who you're supposed to be as an agent. That, if you agree upon that as a part of language, then you have to admit that there's sort of a slippery slope where whatever you assess as being a rich language, whatever you assess as having a sort of cognitive complexity to it, and whatever you assess as not having a sort of cognitive complexity to it, that assessment is almost automatically going to slide into what you think of, or what is indicated into the richness of linguistic ability, cognitive thought, or cognitive complexity. Those two things are going to map pretty quickly to each other, whether you want them to or not. It's sort of a slippery slope there, which is easily slid upon when discussing lower class children difficulties in education, especially when discussing these difficulties in terms of language rather than socialization. This is something I think we keep running up against when we're looking at deficit theory in respect to academic language per se. Is that there are issues with class, obviously, and language. And a lot of the article is spent talking about research that has to do with looking at different genders and different social classes for differences in language. And guess what? There are differences. Who knew? But there's no sort of looking at it in terms of differences with codes in respect to all those things that constantly get reiterated when we talk about the differences between restricted and elaborated codes. Being able to verbalize, being able to contextualize,